So I actually flew in just for this, believe it or not. My wife and our kids are headed to Florida, and when Letty contacted me and said, hey, would you come? I'm like, well, I wasn't really planning to go into SHRM this year after 12 years in a row, and I'm glad I'm here, actually. So I started a research firm about 8 months ago called Key Interval Research, mostly out of my own curiosities of HR and technology. Prior to that, I was a consultant for about 5 years on user adoption of HR software. So I've worked with over 700 software vendors in the space. So if anyone's curious about software, I'm curious as well. But the research I want to talk to you a little bit about today is around implementations. And I used to start off sessions by saying I could make everyone in this room fall down, suck on their thumb, and all I have to do is say one word: implementations. Because everyone's been through a bad one, right? When my partner and I, when we started to research successful implementations, we took the opposite approach. We said, you know what? People are having successful implementations. Why is that? What's the makeup of a successful implementation? So we studied it. 2,500 survey responses, 4 focus groups, 40 qualitative interviews with your peers, and we have a research report. If you want, you can email me. I'll send it to you. It's a great report. But what it does is it goes back through successful implementation. It says, here's what you have to do. Here are the things as a checklist. If you want to have a successful implementation, whether or not it's a payroll software, or succession management, performance management, or an ATS, they all kind of operate the same way from an implementations perspective. So, without any further ado. Sure. Nope. No, there's cell phone over there. All right, as you were. Okay, so that's me with the purple beard. It's not quite purple, but it's getting that way. This is all my contact information. If you need anything, just think of me as a resource. I work with a lot of vendors. So I've never sold anything to HR. I don't really have anything to sell HR because I make all my money and work specifically with vendors. So email me, tweet, whatever you're going to do, and we'll kind of, all I want to do is be a resource to you, quite frankly. So I guess I should stand here. This is actually better. So the first thing that shocked us when we got the data back is when we asked people about like where things kind of went off or whatever, what we learned is 1/3 of the people came back and said things didn't go off the truck. Actually, things were fine. Which shocked John and I because we had just assumed, like everyone else, that, oh yeah, things go off the rails. Like, that just happens, normal, right? 1/3 of the people came back and said, no, actually, it didn't happen like that. So when you look at the data, especially as you get further down, we thought that the insufficient staffing was going to be higher. So of course, whenever you do research, you start with kind of an assumption, you start with a thesis, and then you go out to either prove it or disprove it, right? So when we started this, we thought, you know what, they don't staff. Either the vendor doesn't staff or the employer doesn't staff. We don't staff appropriate, and every implementation has a bit of failure in it. Only to learn that's not true. They're actually a success. And so this was the first thing that kind of shocked us. Now, if I can do anything this morning, it's questionable, but if I can do anything this morning, if you want to have a successful implementation, the first thing you start with is this project transformational or not? So let me give you a for example. All right, so let's say you're switching out ATSs. You're going from JobVite to iSIMS, let's say. If you're just switching the ATSs out, you have a higher chance of failure if you're just switching. So what that means is, what transformational means is that you'll go into your processes, you'll go into the outcomes, and you'll put technology on top of those things. If you don't go into your process, like if you say, no, our process is great, the way we recruit's fantastic, we just need a different tool, and we put a different tool on our already established fantastic process, it'll be fine. Truth is, no, it won't. So the hard reality of, if you're vulnerable enough to say, you know what, while we're switching this out, let's look at our processes. Let's look at the outcomes. let's question everything and then put technology on top of it, that's a transformational project, which has a higher success rate. You'll be able to achieve success if you approach it by saying, we're not just going to switch. We're going to actually dig in. If it's succession management or comp, performance management, whatever the bit is, if you go into your process, the outcomes, you can put inferior technology. Let me say this, maybe the expo will hear me. You can put inferior technology on a great process and get to an outcome. You can't do the opposite. You can't put great technology on a shoddy process and hope that it'll work out. It won't. And so when you're buying software, think of this as, okay, what do I got to do to think about our processes? The vendor should come to the table with processes, by the way. So if you're doing video interviewing, there's 170 video interviewing plays in the world. I know that's kind of a shock to everybody, but there is. They should come to the table with a bunch of processes. Here's what we see work. Here's what we've seen work in other installs. So transformational, success. Not transformational, not success. So this is how you start. And this is a good way to start out a relationship. Like, here's what we're doing. We know that we're going to do a transformational project. We know we're going to dig into our processes. We know that we're going to dig into the outcomes. And we're going to lay the best technology that we can afford on top of that. Project schedule. You start with a schedule that says who's doing what, where, when, and why. Okay? The second thing you do is you put a budget. And this is the foreseen and the unforeseen. So what you don't want, what no one in this room wants is variable consulting hours. No one wants that. That ends badly for everybody, okay? So talking with the vendor about, okay, what should we expect? Is the implementation a fixed cost? Okay? Is it a range? Give us the range, take the higher number. Okay? So go with a solid budget, make sure the vendor sees it and signs off on the budget. Everyone's got to agree. We all have to see the world the exact same way. The project scope. So here's the hard thing about scope. There's a bunch of stuff that y'all don't know about the implementation that they should be able to ask you. So when you talk scope, you ask them, all vendors, where do things kind of expand? Okay, let's take data migration. And you're moving from a payroll system like ADP and you're moving to, let's say, Ceridian. And you want to migrate all your historical data, right? Seems reasonable. Only to find out that your historical data is not that great. And it needs to be cleaned up. And it needs to be standardized. Who does that work? Who's doing that work? And how much does that cost? The vendor should come to the table and give you ideas of what they think costs are. I would rather know, and I think y'all would rather know than be blindsided with a cost bucket 6 months into a project, okay? So the scope is important. Work assignments is, if you think of it, who's doing what when, it's on your team who's doing what, and on their team who's doing what. So here's the thing about having a great relationship with a vendor. You're going to be vulnerable at a certain point where they need to cover you. And they're going to be vulnerable at a certain point and you need to cover them. It's a collaboration. And if you approach it like that, and it's not a gotcha relationship, then they won't gotcha you and you won't gotcha them, okay? So the work assignments is who's doing what. Get into the details. Sally's doing this, Ted's doing that, Jim's doing that. By Tuesday, the more you do that, the straighter the project stays on schedule. And last is risk and risk mitigation. I don't have to tell you anything about risk. If y'all don't know about risk, come see me afterwards and we'll go through it. So this right here is the second part of this is the checklist. So this is 9 things, and this is actually what I want to spend the majority of the 9 minutes with. The 9 things you have to do, there's 3 slides, and these should be ripped out and pinned to a wall anytime you do an implementation. If you do these 9 things, you at least have a 90% success rate in implementations. But you have to do these things with the vendor, if you will. So what is the mission? Why are we doing this? So get back to transformational, not transformational. What is the mission? And this is hard because sometimes you get somebody's pet project or somebody asks you, hey, well, let's switch our leadership assessments. Let's go from this to this, right? Or personality assessments or background screening or whatever, and you haven't really bought in. You're like, okay, yeah, seems reasonable, but you're not really there. What's the mission? What are you really trying to achieve in the switch? Different from transformational, where you're looking at your process, the outcomes, and technology. This is, what are we trying to achieve? Like, at the end of the day, you could be doing anything. Why are you doing this? And it's important to do this with the vendor so that they understand the underpinnings of why you're doing a particular project. Okay? They've got to get it and buy off on it, vice versa. So contract, anything you can push out before you get to contract, the better. Meaning, anything that happens in sales, anything that you have, like, instead of waiting until contract to, like, oh gosh, didn't know how we were going to do data, so sorry, how did it happen? Push all that stuff into sales. Push all that stuff up into the front of the relationship and get it into the contract. Because what happens at almost every vendor is the baton pass between sales and implementation. If it's not in the contract, it's as if you did not have the conversation. So if you went out to dinner and you talked about this, that, and the other, but somehow it doesn't make it into the scope of work of their contract, that conversation never happened. So get everything into the contract, everything that you can think of. There's always going to be an unforeseen, but get everything you can get in there. The implementation team, so you're going to have churn, and they're going to have churn. So some of the people that you had working on, especially a long project, you'll have some people that kind of come and go on that project. They will too. But as much as you can keep that whole, the entire implementation, the better. As much as you can. Again, things that last months and years, it's very difficult for both sides. But as much as you can keep your team and their team whole, everybody wins. Second three, management involvement. I know this is kind of borderline common sense, but what we found when we were researching is if you have your managers and your management define that as you wish, if they're involved and they understand what you're doing and they buy off on it, turns out your implementations go well, right? If they don't, for whatever reason, either you haven't talked to them about it or they don't understand, or let's say they don't like it, turns out your implementations don't go well. Shocking. So getting their buy-in is critical. Implementation project. This right here is all the details of what's going to go on, and especially as it relates to data. This is actually where a lot of projects get off the rails, is when you don't talk about your data, what they're going to do with data, etc. But it's actually having a great implementation project plan. You can use any software you want. You can use Microsoft Project, Basecamp, Excel, doesn't matter, but tracking the project as you would track any normal project. Training. So when I studied user adoption, the one thing that people would ask, what can I do to affect user adoption? How do I get people to use software? The number one thing you can do to get people to use software is train them. So I don't believe that HR should pay for training of software. So I'm kind of one of these odd people that I think the vendor should provide training for the software, and you should never buy it. But at the end of the day, you're going to get the most value out of the software and your spend and return on investment if your users are trained in the software. And if they're not, you'll never realize that goal. It'll always elude you. So you've got to get people trained, however you do it. But like talking about training in the sales process. So we're thinking about moving from success factors to another performance management software. Fantastic. How are we going to get people trained? Like, you should push all that way out into the sales process. How are we going to get people trained? What are we going to do? And if it becomes a thing where you've got to pay for it, initially, I don't like it. But at the end of the day, if you have to pay for it because you're going to get trained, factor it into the price of the software. But get your people trained. Do not gut your training budget because, again, getting back to what makes a successful implementation, it's if your people are trained, success. If they're not so much. So this is, you'll laugh because this is something we found out in the research, is there's always an inevitable disaster. Always. It doesn't matter how much you talk. It doesn't matter how much you got in a contract. All that stuff's great, table stakes, but there will be a moment where they hate you and you hate them. That's where character is born. It's not a question of when this or if this will happen, it's a question of when this will happen. So plan for it. Plan for it. Talk about it. Hey, listen, this is going to be a deal. You're going to miss a meeting. We're going to miss a deadline. These things happen. What do we do to make sure that we get past that? How do we plan for the inevitable disaster? And the more you talk about this in the sales process, the more they can relate to you because you get it. It's like, okay, fair enough. We don't have to act like we're perfect. You're not going to act like you're perfect. Great. Let's do this. Acceptance slash sign off slash go live. First of all, go live is an illusion. It's not really real. Kind of like the tooth fairy-ish. There is no such thing as go live, which is hard because vendors tell you there's a go live. Consultants tell you there's a go live. Oh yeah, there's this magical moment when you go live. Not true. Completely false. There's a moment in which you accept what they've delivered. And that acceptance is a floating, moving goal the entire time. So you've got to basically agree on what is acceptance. What will we all agree is acceptance? Start talking about that from day one. After the contract is signed, what's acceptance? Go live, don't even say that to me. What's acceptance? And navigate towards acceptance. And the last thing I would say, again, after studying user adoption for 5 years of my life, I learned in this survey, this research, that there's actually something beyond user adoption. Like I can get people to use software. You can manipulate and you can do things to get people to use gamification. There's ways to get people to use software. But actually there's a different goal. And the goal is to get people to love the software they use. And if they love the software they use, they're using it. It's assumptive that it's adopted. But you've got to navigate toward how do we get to people, how do we get our employees or our users to love software? And if you navigate towards that goal, you'll get adoption in the midst. So those are the 9 things. That's the report, the successful implementations. It's about a 70-page report. If you'll email me, again, you have my email. I've got cards up there if you want. If you email me, I'll email you a report. Okay? It's a great report. And I want to thank you all for your time.